I spoke a little bit, George spoke a little bit about strengthening India's voices. And one of the things that we want to, or India's voice in the United States, and one of the things that we want to hear from you tonight is, we want to hear your voices, and we want to know if you think our plan and our ideas make any sense. We are at the very early stages of actually developing the base of support that we need for the India Center. Our business plan is pretty simple. Carnegie has an endowment which it uses as seed money and to sustain mature programs. Our typical funding model is to fund 50% of a program's cost from our own endowment, and then to raise program funds in the form of grants from institutions and individuals and government agencies to fund the rest. But to move into India, we need to raise $20 million in endowment funds. And if any of you have been involved in fundraising, you know that raising endowment funds is a really tough thing. When basically a donor gives you endowment money, it's the ultimate expression of faith in what you do. It's not like I'm going to contribute this year and I'll wait to see next year if I like what you're doing. It's basically, I'm giving you the money, you're going to manage it, and you're going to take your idea forward. So it's a big task. We're also seeking to raise some operating funds. We have some already a strong staff in Washington on South Asian issues, and we think we've got a good lead on a number of funding sources in the operating fund area, but you know, we are going to need more. It's very, very important for us to be able to reach out to this community, to people of ideas, people who are advancing their ideas, and who really, whether you're politically active or politically connected or not, is really not the key consideration here. We're really looking to interact with people who are on the cutting edge and who understand the politics and the economics of both countries and of the larger region. It's very, very important to us because ultimately our goal is not only better understanding, but also sustainability. Carnegie's been around for 100 years. It's going to be around for many hundreds more, and it's really an institution that was built to last. So that's our thinking, and that's our goal with the India Center as well. So with those remarks in mind, want to take some questions?
You know what I meant is, George, if you and Charles just want to grab a seat over there.
Sure.
We have two microphones for both of you. Do we have a third? Dan, do we have a third mic for the audience?
Yeah.
Okay. And who's got that mic?
I've got it.
Okay, great. So there's a question over here in the first table.
Well, I have a question to Charles and to George. For Charles, the question is the foundation, your foundation, does it represent the United States or does it represent the people of the world as it has its outlook? And I'll ask the second question later or now? Okay, second question for George is, as you looked at the nuclear energy issue, did you look in the context of an overall energy policy, including solar, including other ways the energy needs could be met, including conservation, or was it just focused on nuclear energy? Thank you.
As to the first question, I want to emphasize that we are very much not an American institution with global offices, but rather a global institution that has a Washington hub. So we are, as George mentioned, we populate our centers with essentially native and native-speaking scholars. We publish in the languages that obtain in the countries in which we operate. Language fluency among the Carnegie scholars is amazing. We have people who often speak several languages, and we also have among our staff in the various centers a very strong English fluency as well. So we've got it coming and going both ways.
I would just add to that because I work in Washington, and there's always a tension, especially in Washington. You know, are you thinking of a problem and proposing solutions from a narrow kind of American interest point of view, or either from a global point of view, or often it's not a global issue, but it's, you know, I work on Iran, for example, and, you know, and so we've always been working on what would it take to find a solution that would be acceptable to both. And that tends to be our perspective, is it's rare, there's almost nothing we write from kind of a narrow, maximalist American position. We tend to be known in Washington as the think tank that thinks most internationally or globally. That's not necessarily, I think it's a good thing, but it's not, it can be a limiting thing in Washington. So, I mean, on congressional testimony, people aren't interested, Congress generally isn't interested in, well, how do the Iranians think about it? It's like, they're going to do it, damn it, or we're going to, So, but this is partly because of the spirit and ethic of the organization, but also our structure. So our comparative advantage is, whether people in Washington want to or not, they need to hear how others think about it. And then we do the opposite in our other centers. And then briefly on your question about the broader energy mix. I've worked historically on the nuclear issue. This was more in the 90s and around 2000 in India. I went and looked into the renewable issues and met a bunch of people working in India on renewables. But I wouldn't claim expertise there. But I think the issue, and this is true in the US, I mean, basically it's about price signals. If you favor a particular technology or fuel and you subsidize it directly or indirectly, that sends one set of price signals. So it's how you set the prices. And often, and this is true in India, there have been incentives for wind power, for example, where there are subsidies, and so you try to send the price signal to favor wind. And my sense, though, in India, but others probably know better than I, is that that's been a bit ad hoc. In other words, there's not a kind of an integrated national strategy that says, okay, to get this kind of output, whether it's from a carbon emission point of view or a distribution point of view, because distribution is a huge problem in India. If you're going to rely on a centralized grid, it makes no sense, first of all. But secondly, it's going to take a lot longer and it's going to cost a lot more and everything else. Well, so if you're going to decentralize, then that takes certain fuel types out and it pushes you towards renewables, for example, to do decentralized power. But I don't know that there's a national strategy or the capacity to move. I mean, one of the struggles in India, as you all know, is collective action's a real problem. I mean, everything happens slowly and then it gets kind of compromised in various ways. So it's very hard to have a decisive strategy and then implement it. And I think on energy, this is what would be needed, especially to, for example, go to distributed power. And my guess is that it'll happen on a state-by-state basis. It won't happen in a central way, but some states will take initiative, the states that are better governed, and figure out how to do this.
I have a question for George. Looking in the rearview mirror, if the companies had proposed thorium-based power versus plutonium-based, which is all Westinghouse, would it have been gone better, because there is tremendous resources, raw material in India for thorium, and now they are trying to build a thorium-based nuclear power.
Yeah, and again, everybody in this room is more of a technologist than I am, but doesn't stop us. The Indian program all along was meant to rely on thorium, but so as Homi Bhabha designed it, it was a 3-stage process. But to get to thorium, you had to go through plutonium, so you could produce breeders, which then could use thorium around them to then produce more fuel. Now, there's a problem with doing the plutonium part. So the second stage is plutonium breeder reactors, and they have one demonstration reactor that's underway. No other country has made a plutonium breeder program work. So the French gave up, the Russians pretty much have given up, the Japanese gave up, the US didn't try. It hasn't worked any place. Maybe it'll work in India. My friend V.S. Arunachalam, who was a former scientific advisor to the defense minister, who's looked at this and says the breeder doesn't breed. So it won't work. but there's still a commitment to it. After that is supposed to come thorium, and my understanding of the problem of thorium from talking to, is that on paper, thorium fuel cycle really makes sense. But as an engineering issue, no one's ever figured out how they could make it work, in part because thorium's a very hard material to work with. It's a very hard problem to engineer. And so, again, people will say in principle, like fusion, in principle, you know, it would be great and it really work, but I don't know that there's anybody that says operationally that this is the way to go. So the government's concluded more or less that, they haven't announced it, and that was the idea of the nuclear deal, was to bring in light water reactors and pressurized water reactors to get the thing moving, and so that's why the nuclear deal was so important.
Thank you. Okay, so here's, thank you both, Charles and George, for coming. So Charles, I'm very encouraged by the idea that you want to set up a center in India, and hopefully, you know, India's voice could be heard. But one of the comments about India's voice is because India doesn't really have a voice, because they speak in so many voices. Okay, I mean, those of us, I left India 45 years ago. I still keep going back and forth to India. So if you can help decipher what India is saying, and this is one of the reasons India is so well misunderstood in the Western world. Okay. So that's a great stuff. So going back to the voice now, and George, question for you. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he really pushed very hard, tried to get the civil nuclear pact done, as you know. India Inc. lobbied very hard in America. They came and they really reached out to all the prominent Indians in every state. You know, they came over here, and a lot of our colleagues, they kind of got behind it. Even over in the US, you know, Congress, I mean, the Democrats were kind of opposed to it, Republicans were kind of, you know, more or less kind of for it. And the lobbying effort that kind of went on by the Indian government was immense. So what went wrong? I mean, Prime Minister wanted it so bad, you know, okay, we know it's a coalition government and he got to satisfy the companies, all kind of, but what really went back? Why has he lost the momentum that he's not continuing with the same vigor as he had? In 7 years, this thing is kind of stalled going nowhere.
Well, you described it very, very well, Mike. I think several things. One of them is that this is a generic problem with nuclear power outside of China. So in other words, and France. I mean, France is, although with the French elections, it's going to be interesting. I mean, there's kind of a movement in France. I mean, not an anti-nuclear movement per se, but the socialists have said they'll cut back and so on. But you look what's happening in Germany, Italy, other places. Outside of China, which has a big program, it's very difficult everywhere for the reasons that I mentioned. You talk to private equity people, as I've done in New York about nuclear, they said, there's no way we're going to touch it. You talk to these guys, you talk to the you know, people who are promoting it, and you ask for costs, and they say, well, plus or minus 35%. And so it's difficult everywhere, number one. Number two, there actually wasn't any bottom-up demand or interest for it. And it was something, you're absolutely right, it was something that for years had been advocated, at the top of the list whenever Indian officials would come to the U.S. But I think some of it was political and symbolic, and I'm very sympathetic to this. It was remove the restrictions, remove what seemed to be the prejudicial discrimination against India, which I can understand having that be on the top of the list. But behind that wasn't necessarily, and nuclear's going to be great and we want to do all this. So the restrictions were removed. So that was accomplished in many ways. And then is left the real issue. The last thing I would say on this is, which was illuminating to me, there was a moment, and I forget in what year, but it was after 2008, and it looked like the Prime Minister it wasn't going to happen. The Parliament wasn't going to approve the deal. Like, no way. And I remember a group of Indian CEOs, I think it was CII, I don't think it was FICCI, but brought a delegation to Washington. I went to dinner with them. And it was really interesting. They all, to a man, and there were a couple of women, and so they all said, well, nuclear's not that important. You know, what we really need is like infrastructure and roads, and so it was like they were off nuclear. Every one of them, nuclear's not that, it was oversold. And so I was laughing to myself, because I had said all along it was oversold. But when it looked like India wasn't going to be able to approve it, the script changed. And then which I thought was revealing actually of the reality, which is, it isn't the most important thing, although it was symbolically and politically and ethically very important. And so I think that's one of the problems, is the Prime Minister still wants and is pushing. But if he looks behind him and says, who else really wants this that badly, he's kind of out there, more or less on his own, which is not a great position to be in.
And we, in this country, are also frequently guilty of some fuzzy-headed thinking on energy matters. Just think about corn-based ethanol.
Yeah, I have a more generic question. You mentioned about Burns, his op-ed, and he's very frustrated that we did so much for India and they did not do it in return. And so you mentioned a problem, as you said, that it's much easier to deal with dictators, because you say they will do it, they will do it. But it is a democracy. And this is a democracy too. I mean, there's one senator, he can stop the whole thing. I mean, this has happened just recently, right? The Arizona senator. So my question is that, do you guys have some specific ideas of how to change that? Like, you're going to have an office in Delhi. Do you have some specific ideas? How do you actually make the US government officials more aware of what goes on in democracy, and vice versa?
That's the idea, is to bring more nuanced descriptions of the dynamics in India, for example.
Yeah, which today it is a nuclear, but tomorrow there will be some other things also. This will go on.
Inevitably. I mean, and including Iran. I mean, including India's relationship with Iran. I mean, India has deep cultural ties to Iran, historic ties to Iran, it has geographic interests, it has energy interests. So the idea that's kind of simple in the U.S. Well, the Iranians are the bad guys, and India, is our friend. So India should be, it's not realistic. So our idea, it's nothing profound in it, and it's not magic. Is you go to politicians who can understand in their own districts or their own state all the dynamics, and so you bring people, you say, okay, in India it's like this, so like you have this problem in Nebraska, and Uttar Pradesh they have this problem, and so you try to explicate it in ways that people can relate to. And now the base where India has a great advantage that countries that aren't democratic don't, is that there isn't a fundamental clash with India. There isn't a risk of what the United States is never going to attack India. India's never going to go to war with the United States. So one doesn't have that confidence with China. We can hope, we can plan, but one is an issue. So the baseline is that it's not enmity in any way. It's all about the degree of friendship and cooperation. And so that we can further explicate. But therein comes a problem. Whether it's with child rearing or maybe in your companies, but certainly in government, the problem child gets the most attention. So what happens in the U.S. is, I mean, naturally you focus on the ones that you think are your enemy or the threat or whatever. But the countries that are, they're friends, but they're not doing that much for us, but they're friends, doesn't rise to the top. So part of our challenge is to say, while all that's the case, and this I think is the most important point, India's intrinsic value is so important, in part because of its scale, right? So you got more than 1 billion people. In part because it's this unprecedented in world history case of like it's the most diverse polity that's ever tried to manage itself democratically. There's nothing that's even come close. And so as a demonstration project, it's intrinsically important. From the standpoint of the global environment, it's intrinsically important. Whatever happens in India is going to affect. So getting people to understand that even if India doesn't do a single thing for the United States, what India does for itself has profound interest, has profound effect on the United States and the world. So we should be doing what we can to augment Indians doing for themselves in ways that actually make the world better. That's a hard sell, because it's not the way people normally think. I think it's the reality, and I think it is possible to explain, but that's going to take a lot of repetition and time. And so that's part of our intentions. You can't just do it, you know, with one person or two. You have to have an enduring presence and bring people back and forth.
Those of us who live in the Beltway, we spend a lot of time talking to governments, our own and others, and I think very much the case in India, where you've got such a populist democracy. There are many other actors, and a lot of what we're trying to accomplish with the center in terms of improving the understanding doesn't just mean government to government. It also means important private actors, business people, and citizens. And ultimately, one of our great challenges is in a world in which the Egyptian revolution and other very important political movements now are being communicated through Twitter and Facebook, and very much on a micro individual level with technology. A challenge for us, and one that we're really hoping we can realize worldwide, is to get the kind of information that we handle and analyze out in really to a mass audience. So you know, we're gonna work it from government to government, but also from the bottom up wherever possible.
So George, if I were to get it right, if you guys were present in India all this while, Indo-US nuclear deal would never have taken place, because the US would have been very well educated that the expectations are very unrealistic. But that was just a comment. Real question is that I've read somewhere that Iran, all that it is doing, and in light of how the rest of the world has treated countries like North Korea and Pakistan, that Iran is being a rational actor in pursuing what it is pursuing.
On the nuclear deal, one of the wonderful things about Carnegie is we're very diverse. So Ashley Tellis, who is our leading South Asian expert, the nuclear deal was basically his idea. He was working for Ambassador Blackwell in Delhi in 2001, 2002, then came to the White House, and then came here. And the nuclear deal grew out of a memo that he wrote for Condi Rice in 2004, in which he gave several options, and the most ambitious was the nuclear deal. And so Phil Zelikow and Condi Rice said, yeah, let's go for that one. So they actually called my boss and said, we want Ashley to take a lead from Carnegie to negotiate the deal. So he was, and he still is, the main champion of the deal. I, for the reasons I articulated, said this is like totally oversold, and there's some specific problems with it. So we debated within Carnegie in front of our board. So we had the kind of the leading advocate of the deal and one of the leading critics in the same organization. And we're dear friends. The Iran issue, there's a lot to say about the Iran issue. It's actually in Iran, I find, and I've been working on this since 1993 with Iranians. They cite India as a model. They will never cite Pakistan as a model, because as one of the leaders to Velayati, who was the foreign minister, one of the advisors to him, told me when I was visiting this man once in his office in Tehran, and as I was leaving, he says, "Where are you going now?" I said, "Pakistan." I said, "Pakistan, is that a country?" Which is a very kind of Persian view of things. And because of the Taliban and so on, they would never refer to India, though, they say, look, India is a great civilization, like Iran. India is vital globally in its region, like Iran. Iran's the major country in the Middle East. It's the major oil and energy exporter. you got over India getting the bomb, and in fact, you've now changed all the rules to cooperate with India. So you'll get over it with us, is the way they put it. Now, they don't do what you were alluding to, Venk, in the sense that because they insist they don't want nuclear weapons, they can't then invoke North Korea and so on, because they say, we don't want nuclear weapons. We want the fuel cycle. And so for that, they say, well, Japan has it, doesn't have the bomb, and so we want to be like that. But in terms of their being outside of the international rules, as it were, and so the pressure on them, on that one, they use India as the example. They say, India used to be outside the rules. You used to pressure India. And then you finally realize how important India was, and so you change the rules. And that's what you're going to do for Iran. Is how they-
But the suggestion is that Iran is being a rational actor in pursuing the nuclear weapon option.
Well, but again, to have the capability, I think you're right. I actually think having what they're doing to get the capability, there's a reason for it, from status, prestige, and also potentially as a long-range deterrent. Because who they want to influence are the Arabs. And Rafsanjani said as much. Because they started developing this capability during the war with Iraq, when they were being hit with chemical weapons, and the U.S. was on Iraq's side. And the rest of the world did nothing to hold Iraq to account. So they started developing this capability to deal with their neighbors. And now there's this a sense of also, if the U.S. is going to come and do regime change, then the U.S. will think twice. And so I think having that capability, whether we can debate it, but I think that's why, I think you're right, I think that's why they're doing it. And it's not totally unfounded. I mean, it's a high-stake gamble, because you can get whacked in the process. So there's a certain gamble, and it may not save your regime. If that's the ultimate thing you're trying to do, and now your currency's been devalued 75% in the last year, and your economy's crashing, and you're having to do barter trade, you may get this capability but lose your regime. But it's not crazy.
20% or so of Indian population is Muslim. And I don't think there is a understanding of that in US. And so how much you think India's choosing not to send troops to Kuwait relates to its own internal problems that it would encounter should it take such actions?
I think that must have been at the top of, I think there were a number of issues, but that had to be high among them. And I think there were people in the U.S. government that at least knew that at some level, but didn't internalize it to understand how that would affect the dynamic. I also have to remember it was a BJP government, so that wasn't their vote bank. I mean, so they were less concerned about that at the time. So that's who they were dealing with was a BJP government that wasn't as concerned about it. But I think in general, that political reality is not very well understood at all in the U.S. I mean, just it's among the things that aren't very well understood.
Is this a pure propaganda that Iran wants to eliminate Israel and Israel will someday bomb Iran? Or is it pure propaganda, or is it truth? What is your opinion about
Well, I have opinions. I don't know about the truth, but I have opinions.
You'll take your opinion.
And my opinion will probably get me in trouble. I may be writing this, but you have to be really careful on this. Ahmadinejad has, in particular, said some very, very provocative and inhumane things about Israel. So that's a fact. Now, you have to wonder why he keeps doing it, and one of the reasons is, and I alluded to this in response to Fink's question, is Iran's fundamental worry is the Arabs. So Shias are a minority ultimately. What happened when Ahmadinejad first in like 2006 started saying the real scathing things about Israel, all of a sudden they looked and became the most popular guy in the Arab world. I mean, in public opinion polls. And so they realized that bashing Israel and threatening Israel is a really useful thing to deal with their main problem, which is kind of a Sunni Arab problem. So they keep doing that, and it's smart. Now, one of the flip sides of that is, and this is the part that gets me in trouble, Iran really needs Israel. In fact, they need Israel with Bibi Netanyahu as the prime minister to keep doing what he's doing. The minute Iran wipes Israel off the map, the Sunnis will applaud for a couple of days and then turn and say, now you guys are the problem. Right? And who are they going to bash? So it's perfect to have Israel doing settlements, not negotiating with the Palestinians, I mean, doing all of the things that they're doing, and you know, you can wake up in Iran and go, I'm going to go bash the Israelis today, and the Arabs are going to like it, and so on. It doesn't cost them anything. So even if Israel didn't have nuclear weapons, I think that would be the case, that it's nice to have them there. But the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons means that, I mean, the Iranians, the leaders of Iran are always old men. You don't get to be an old man being reckless and suicidal. And so if you attack Israel like that, you know, it's done. So it's now, on the other end, if you're on the receiving end of it, in Israel, I mean, look, you have to, I mean, it's fine to do this calculation. And Barak, the defense minister, and others said, no, it's not, I know, they're not going to attack us with nuclear weapons. But they're going to do some other stuff that's going to really make things difficult. And so, but then it gets played here, because Ahmadinejad says these things, then the image of it is the Iranians are going to wake up one day and obliterate Israel, which isn't really what the game is.
Wow, that was a terrific discussion. Nice round of applause for our speakers here. It's very, very interesting that while we're off trying to do our entrepreneurship thing and our technology and all of that, I mean, we are fortunate to have people like this who really are looking out for the world to make sure that our products exist a few years from now. So thank you both very much for doing that. I'm sure if you'd like to talk to them one-on-one, we're going to be around for a few more minutes. We don't have to, usually Dan doesn't kick us out until, you know, closer to like 8:45 or so, so we've got a few minutes for networking. Again, March, what did I say the next date was? March 27th. Thank you. That's the next charter member dinner meeting, so keep that in mind. And thank you all for joining us this evening.